Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Davis.
No, Steve Harris, actually. See, I got my name in italics. Sorry. My name's Steve Harris, and I'm going to be talking about some work we're doing at Oxford with the NCI and increasingly with UK governments as well about semantic frameworks, about arrangements of software and services and approaches that allow you to do well-described, semantically interoperable information systems. The kind of the motivating example for this, we've already heard about tamoxifen today, was the revolutionary, very important tamoxifen meta-analysis that was done over a decade ago now, where a whole bunch of different clinical studies were brought together, common variables, common pieces of data were identified, analysed together, and it was found that tamoxifen was contributing significantly to people's survival with breast cancer. Richard was my first boss in clinical research. He brought me in from a Microsoft solutions provider to work on clinical trials information systems. So in 1983, this collaborative group was formed, and now they have a consensus on 30 variables, a data model, submission format, and every 5 years they publish an analysis. And what this means is that we have computable data as an evidence base for early stage breast cancer, which means that we can be pretty sure the best way to treat populations with the drugs and the approaches that we have available. Sad thing is this isn't common in science. It's certainly not common in clinical research. So the Cancer Grid principal investigators try to do the same thing with cisplatin in ovarian cancer, looking at some particular genes that are implicated in cell growth. And they only got 80 studies with 4,000 patients, should get some real significant results from this, but they couldn't draw any conclusions whatsoever. There wasn't enough metadata for them to take even 2 of the studies and put them together with any reliability so that they could answer whether it was worthwhile giving people with ovarian cancer these cisplatin drugs. There's also problems with persistence of data as well. Richard Dahl published the statistical analysis of the British doctors study, which proved lung cancer causation by smoking in 1956. But since then, what's happened? Well, the microcircuit was invented in 1958, and today is the 40th anniversary of the mouse. So a lot happens. These particular data sets that have been produced are still being gathered today and are still being used for analysis today. So the persistence of meaning for these big population studies across long periods of time is also very important. So we've been developing this idea that we can put together a semantic framework, a whole bunch of tools, services and approaches that allow people to characterize the types of data they're recording so that that data can be reused, and also to reduce the drudgery of producing software by allowing us to use software product line approaches, as Jeremy talked about yesterday in the Birds of a Feather, to generate software for science, for the common experimental types that we all use. We also want architectures that reflect on the metadata and act accordingly. In clinical research, commonly we have something called a Kaplan-Meier plot, which is a stepped plot of a population dying or succumbing to disease. It wouldn't be great if your visualization system saw the fact that you've got a set of death dates with no other data in it and said, well, actually, you look like you want to do a Kaplan-Meier plot. That would be a really useful clippy to have in your piece of software. And this is prospective and retrospective. It isn't simply about setting standards and asking people to use them. It's also how do you go describing stuff that already exists. And really to do this, what you need to do is you need to take control of stuff. You need to administer things. So I've got a laser pointer and I'm going to use it. Does it work? Should just point. So we have these things that we want to record, terms, our foundation of understanding with definitions that allow us to be able to explain what our definitions mean and refer to a dictionary or a thesaurus. From these, we distill out, describe the common measurements and observations we make in a domain. Now, some of those we'll just report. Some of those we'll want to standardize and pre-coordinate so that we can do analysis. And then finally, our minimum data sets, our models of our information systems are described in terms of both of these things so that we can properly understand what they do, find the bits of it that we want to reuse, understand the data they produce. So, a little bit on metadata registries. I ought to get rid of those notifiers, shouldn't I, really? Metadata registry stores common observations and attributes and attaches value domains and measurement protocols to concepts from relevant ontologies and measurable properties. And it gives the value domains meaning so that it links them back into your ontology so that you can uplift your data into the ontology world when you want to do analysis, or you can use your ontology to help you work out whether you've got the same data element being declared by someone or the data elements are relatable or they can transform between them. And it provides a structure for this. And we've been using, along with the NCI, a standard called ISO 11179 to do this work. Now, this is entirely sympathetic with the work, the W3C work that has been described over the last couple of days. What this standard allows you to do is it provides a framework for the administration of producing interoperable data. And it also provides you with a basis for a URI identification framework so that you can refer to that data and its properties, which basically means that this allows you to describe what's going on in the silo so you can liberate data from the silo onto the semantic web. And this is one of the things we've been doing using W3C standards. The other thing it does is it allows you to wrap up little balls of context. So, for instance, density in kilograms per meter cubed at standard temperature pressure. You don't regularly measure the temperature and pressure around you when you do a density measurement in chemistry or in physics, because generally speaking, the variation isn't very much, but it's still part of that context. You can wrap that up into a little ball, declare it, and that saves you money because you can't always record the entire context around your experiment, around your observation. Sometimes you just have to say, no, there's a little atom here and we're not going to break it down any farther. This standard is becoming widely used. The EPA in the US, in Meteor in Australia, certainly CADSR, which many of you will be familiar with, use the standard, as do we do. So what does a metadata registry look like? This is ours. So basically it allows you to record data elements and various parts of those data elements. So here is a search screen that shows pretty much the information that a user of a data element is very interested in. So it tells them what its name is, what their other names are in different languages. It gives you a definition so that they can decide whether that's kind of useful to them, and it describes what type of values you can record. It describes the value domain. So I'm focusing on this ECOG performance status data element, which is used for characterizing the health and well-being of a patient in a clinical study, according to whether you can't tell whether they've got the disease or at 5, whether they're dead. And when you drill into it, you get a lot more information. You find out who's controlling this. You find some different naming languages. So, for instance, we've partially translated this into Italian, and we have not only a name but a definition in Italian as well. So somebody could come into the metadata registry and use that as well to help coordinate international data sharing. Additionally, we can strap it up to the to whatever terminology that we're particularly interested in. Here you can see there's a whole bunch of URI references at the top of the screen in the top right-hand corner that refer to the NCI thesaurus. And these explain and place the meanings of the enumerations in our understanding of cancer. We can also assert various relationships with different data elements, and this is a place that we could put a transformation between two different types of data elements so that we can accomplish meta-analysis, replay meta-analysis when we want to, and also we can store a number of reference documents that further qualify what we're doing. Finally, we can analyze out our metadata elements in terms of of ontologies and terminologies, and if that's done in the right way, you could use that to simply uplift into OWL. So you have an OWL ontology that provides your domain model. You could lift up all of your data into that area by using the subject predicate object that has been pre-curated, analysed here in the metadata element. But the start of the journey doesn't need to be very hard. You don't need to understand how to use the ontologies. That the metadata registry can provide a way that you break up this process and give people a very easy screen with 4 or 5 pieces of information to record. Who am I? Who am I working for? Who's looking after this registry? What do I call it? What's its definition? And that starts the curation process where you record more and more pieces of information of meaning. If this works its way up into a standard, then obviously more information is added, more annotation occurs. But it's simply not enough to have this. I think you need to find ways of getting them into the hands of real users in the places where they need them. So what we've been working on is we've been working on add-ins in Microsoft Office and common desktop modelling tools, because those are the places where people need the metadata, need to do the annotation. And they shouldn't have to go to a separate website to do this work. What they should do is just grab a bar somewhere at the side, launch a plugin, go search for it, and use it in the context of their work. Now, I'm just going to break out and do a little demo here. So here's some videos that I recorded earlier. This is play. Okay. So here's Microsoft Excel, and what we do, you see, is that there are not many button patterns you can use in Visual Studio.net, so we've got a nice smiley face. But that invokes our Query Service Manager plugin at the side. And what we're going to do is we're going to search our metadata registry, and we're going to look for a data element that we want to use. So we put ECOG in a Google-style search, Windows Live-style search, excuse me, and this allowed us to go and look for the definition, decide whether we want it. Okay, so how do we use it? Well, that's quite simple. We just grab a range of cells, press the Use button, and what that does is that takes the definition of that data element and types that Excel column. It puts the name above it, it puts the enumerations in the drop-down for you to use, and of course, that provides you with all the benefits of validation. It will stop you from putting wrong data into the cell. And also, in the background, what it's done is it's created a spreadsheet that brings in the essential pieces of metadata, the identifier and the, getting ahead of myself here, the identifier, the naming, and the value domain, brought that into Excel as well, so the whole spreadsheet becomes semantically well described. So this piece of what lots and lots of scientific data is recorded in suddenly has the capability now to properly describe what it means. In a later version of our plugins, then there's also an Add Data Element button from here as well that takes you to a very similar screen to what I showed originally that has a very small amount of information that you need to record just to get the process started. Okay, so let's go back, view, full screen mode. So we've been working with the NCI on the uses of some of these plugins and the integration of CADSR and CGMDR, which I'll talk about a little now. Particularly, there's a use case for the National Marrow Donor Program. So what they do is they keep records of people who would like to donate bone marrow. And this is very important because leukemia and lymphoma need bone marrow transplants. And it's a difficult process. There's a lot of information that needs to be recorded about this for you to be able to decide whether a person's a match. Quite often that match won't be in the family. So there are, I believe, about 100 forms of information that need to be collected. And what the Marrow Donor Program wants to do is it wants to take its forms and it wants to annotate those against the Cancer Data Standards Repository, CADSR, so that they can describe the types of information they're recording better and then start to use the tools that are in CA Big to move data around and to do good stuff. So these 100 complex forms, they've already been entered into Microsoft Excel, into spreadsheets, and what we're doing is we're using the Excel plugin not to type columns, but to annotate and place concept references and references to the metadata elements to which this particular piece of information on the form relates to, so that they can map together their forms to CADSR, and then finally we'll export an XML representation of that and work with that. The spreadsheet's quite complicated. This is an example spreadsheet, and as you can see there's a column there with CDE ID. I haven't got a video of them of this being used in anger. The next thing that we're working on is the federation of metadata registries, because in science, definitions of data that's collected is a distributed process. It's not a centralized process. We've been working on the close to the scientist end, as the NCI have been working on the central data community control end. So what we've been doing is we've been working on how we're going to do this process, how we're going to exchange messages, what it means to take a data element from one metadata registry to pass it to some other metadata registry, and how that would be used. So for instance, if I'm a scientist working in a wet bench lab somewhere doing bioinformatics, the data elements I create aren't going to be particularly rigorous. They're not going to be curated to the high standards that you would expect for a preferred standard for the CA Big community, for instance. So when CA Big would take a data element that I produced, they would probably want to do further work on it, whereas I'd take their metadata elements as read, just import them into my registry and just use those. So here's a kind of an overview of the processes that are going on. There's all sorts of data and metadata sources that need to be registered and stored in the local cancer centres, and then these are brought together and accumulated, and the standards process is moved forward so that you get just enough standards just in time and not just in case, as Carol once said. And we move forward to this area where CADSR, CGMDR work together to cope with certain types of metadata and allow those to flow throughout the scientific community for them to be created in a more natural fashion that maps the process of knowledge discovery. But we can do more than that. The thing is now we've got more information about our models. We've described our models in terms of terms and metadata elements. We can start triggering from those descriptions, and we can start using those to produce software. So you can go and take a class diagram and right-click on it and say, produce me an XML schema already. But if that XML schema has identifier mappings back to the metadata registry into the conceptual space from your ontology, then the source annotations inside your schema can be generated, and your schema is a fully compliant member of the semantic web. So this is the CDE browser used for creating forms in CADSR. We've got something similar, but we were quite interested in taking the automation further and producing a software production line for clinical trials management systems. So effectively what you would do is you go to look at your metadata databases, you generate a trial design from grabbing the data elements to describe the clinical variables you want to record, then you generate your running clinical trial system. We're moving towards using SharePoint in this, and then that XML data can then be treated with various tools, reflect back on the schemas and turn that into RDF so that you can use it with all those tools that the W3C are fostering the production of. So what we do here is we use InfoPath, although again we're probably going to be moving to Silverlight here, to provide a user interface, a user environment for the completion of the metadata about the clinical trial and the purposes that you want to work with. And the whole process effectively is that you make a meta model for your experiment. You describe all of the things that you need to know about your experiment in a UML class diagram, and then from that you generate your schema from which you can provide a user interface. Certain places in the meta model are left open. So for instance here it says that case report forms are defined as sequences of sections or metadata elements, and it doesn't specify what metadata elements you record. So this model could equally be used for cancer research, it could be used for Alzheimer's or vaccines research, or it could be used with suitable changes to terminology, probably even for crop yields, because they're all part of Fisher's randomized controlled trial experiment that he devised in the 1930s. And there are places for concept references as well to provide extension points for the common data elements you've brought in. And then you take from that, as already said, you generate your schema, and then you can use something like InfoPath to fill that in. So what we do is we incorporate the metadata element information into the forms in pretty much the same way as I've shown you already with the Excel example. I have a little video of it. I think I'm going to pass on the video because I'll probably run out of time if I show it to you. But I can talk about this offline. But essentially, you do the same thing. You have a user interface. You say, at this point in this form, I want to record patient ECOG performance status. You go look it up in the metadata registry. Yeah, I've got quite a few slides to come there. So maybe come back to that. I really ought to turn off that notifier. So, data sharing services. Let me do that now before I get really embarrassed, shall I? Somewhere there should be some Google notifiers. No, I can't find them. Doesn't matter. Let's live dangerously, shall we? Where's my full screen view? Jeremy, please don't. Where are I? Sorry. I've slightly got distracted by that. Page display. Keep going down, keep going down. Right. Full screen mode. Great, excellent. The thing is now that we've got a recipe for a data sharing service. So I've got this model of what it is to be a phase 3 clinical trial, but I could equally have a model of what it is to be a long-running epidemiology study or a retrospective cohort or any other type of experiment I'm interested in. I just follow the same recipe. I take somebody's standard of what they think we should be doing when we record information about this clinical research. I derive a model from that, and I ornament that model with terms and concepts and metadata elements from appropriate ontologies, and that allows me, firstly, to pre-curate my experiments, to describe what I'm doing, but also if it's post-curation, if I'm taking something that exists already, then I'm making an entry that describes, annotates the work that's done, and can describe the data model of the data that I want to share. So I can catalog experiments with this. I could have a trial register, for instance, which describes all the current running clinical trials, or I could go to a large, well-established medical research organization, and I can say, well, this is how we're going to curate all of the large population data sets that you have available, and this is how people are going to navigate around them, draw commonality between them. You could ask a question of, I'm interested in survival information with lung cancer, and this type of network, a network of concepts and metadata elements and models will allow you to answer that question quite clearly, bring in a whole bunch of data sets and then try to decide whether they're useful and whether you want to contact the people who own it to do data sharing. So we've got a number of examples of generation. The stuff that I've been working on uses a number of open source tools and W3C tools, so I work in XQuery quite regularly. Charlie and Andrew, who sit beside me, do this kind of work in SharePoint, but I'm presenting stuff that I can talk about rather than their SharePoint, which I don't quite understand. Effectively, what you do is you take the metadata registry and you use that to ornament your class diagram. And from your class diagram, you can generate an XML schema, and then from there onwards, you're into a generation path. Part of the generation path talks about how you take the form in your application framework and present to the user, stuff the data in that you want them to edit with the form. Part of it is also about recovering extra information from the model that you've been doing the annotation. Schema doesn't have all the information that you might want to show on a form, so you've got to find ways to recover that. Ultimately, you could go back and look in your metadata registry for things like the question that you want your form to ask. So your data element might be called patient ECOG performance status, but your question might be, please assess the patient's performance according to this scale. And it will go back to the metadata registry. If you've got that information, bring that into your form and allow you to use that in your application. And it all works very simply with XSLT. Here's a little fragment of a style sheet transform that looks for an XForms input called change description, and then says, we'll just replace this for a text area, for a memo box, basically. And you can get this kind of transformation relatively straightforward. You can also ask questions. There are a number of annotations you can put in your metadata registry that could key default transformations in your generation framework. And what we're doing is we're using this with a group who study vaccines, particularly childhood vaccines in Oxford University, the CCVTM. And we're going to be using this to generate an information system for this ACWY trial that looks at a couple of different meningitis vaccines so that you could get immunised for meningitis if you go into a place where meningitis is prevalent. I believe sub-Saharan Africa is one such place. So the process basically goes is you go through the forms and you register metadata elements for each of the items on the case report forms, and then you get a registry schema generated, which I'll hopefully show you, and then from that you can author the form just by bringing in the different schema elements and simple types, how you want to use it, and then once you've got the schema, generate the X form and deploy it to your application framework with Ant in this case. This is the sort of work that we're going to be doing with SharePoint and Silverlight. We've just been funded by Microsoft to take this work forward in early phase cancer clinical trials, as Jeremy talked about in the Birds of the Feather yesterday. And all of these tools will be recast and made much more powerful in this environment. The great thing about SharePoint is that the actual amount of extra work you need to do to get this working is much, much less than if you were deploying against JBoss or in this case, Exist, as I'm going to show. Does that then mean that, yes. Okay, I take my life into my hands here, and somewhere down here I should have a virtual machine. And if it comes back to me, then maybe we can show some generation. Right, before I do that, what I will do is I'll go to my metadata registry, and so if I control minus here, I should be able to get a slightly smaller result. If I log in, will it come back to the center? No, it won't. You can just about see on the side of the screen here, I've just gone to the maintenance section. At the bottom here, I've got something called schema. So what's happened here is this is a metadata registry that has all the data elements for 3 of the forms in the ACWY trial, and I can just simply click on the schema functionality, and what that will do is that will go and calculate what these metadata elements look like as an XML schema with the sourced annotations that refer directly back to the metadata registry so that it's all well characterized. So I've got a schema. Let's open it up. With a little bit of luck, Oxygen will kick into action in a second, and we can have a look at the schema and see what it looks like. So value domains in this world get transformed into simple types, and data elements become XML elements of type simple type. It's as straightforward as that. So here's the schema. If I just, oops, no, that's putting it away. I still haven't got used to that bit of. You can tell I've spent most of my life in Windows. So here you can see, there we are. So I've got a simple type here. It's a restriction on a string with an enumeration of yes and no, so it's a simple Boolean style field. And here I've got a URI that points back to my metadata registry and identifies this particular data element with this particular schema element with this part of the identifier for the value domain. And similarly, so those are the value domains. Later down in the schema, I've got all the simple elements. Okay? And what they do is they associate a name and a type together, and again, they have the identifiers here in the source identifier space of the metadata element itself rather than the value domain. So this is a W3C schema with semantic annotations generated automatically from a system by people who don't need to understand what schema looks like to get this to work. And simply I can just start entering the model for my form at the bottom of this particular schema. So if I go to my virtual machine, is that the one? Nope, that's not the one. I think I have it open, don't I? There we are. If I go to my virtual machine, I should have a command window here. So firstly, here's my Exist database. Just to show I've got nothing up my sleeves, I'll refresh. I don't have any other collections on anything up there. Maybe I won't. Okay, and I can go down to here and I can run my AND script. And what my AND script will do is build the application. It will take all those pieces of information. It will generate the export by running the generator against it. It will grab all the information out of the schema that isn't already in the export, and it will do the work for us and provide ourselves with a complete application. And when it gets to the end, we're going to have a look at what that application looks like. So here we are. We're storing some schemas now to the XML database. And right at the very bottom, it says my build's successful, which is really good. I can go and have a look for it inside my database. Yes, here we got ACWY. I can go and have a look at what's inside it. And as you can see, I've got various bits and pieces here. I've got some web pages. Here I've got some X forms in here. And then I can go to my web browser. I would have done all of this in Windows, but Parallels trashed my boot camp, so I'm a little challenged in that respect. And I can go to the ACWY Trials Management System, and then I've got a working system now that I've got forms that will enter and produce data. Come back to me, please. I think, right, yes. So let's log in, because I shouldn't be able to enter any data if I don't log in. And I can go and create a new registration form, and that will load up my X form. It will show it in the browser, and as you can see, I've got all of the different bits and pieces inside my case report form. My required fields are outlined in red. It's brought in it knows that's a date field, for instance, so it will put the date value in, and then once I've entered it, again, this is just in the style sheet itself. There's no programming to get that kind of work to occur. My drop-down lists have all got the right values in there, and I can just submit this to the form, to the server, and record the form as part of my trials management system. Okay, so real software, last couple of slides now. So one of the things that we're excited about here is some of the opportunities for very large amounts of data sets being gathered. This was something I noticed in Analyst at the beginning of the year. It may look just like a couple of shoeboxes to you, but what this is a PCR amplifier analyzer that essentially has a bill of materials cost of $1,000. And as you can see, it runs with an Apple Macintosh here as it happens, but any old laptop you can plug into it, run the software on there, and you can imagine sticking a couple of these in the back of a Land Rover and taking them out to the Sudan, for instance, and monitoring disease epidemic outbreaks. And these pieces of information, let's pretend that there was an outbreak of a disease. You can use this to work out whether somebody has the disease relatively quickly. But it's very difficult. You've got to be able to move information around very fast. For instance, in SARS, it took just 5 days in 2003 to sequence the coronavirus. And with the tools that are becoming available, we're going to have to move lots of information around. Dataset definitions, instrument parameters, new terminologies, ontologies need to be generated automatically. And what the framework I've described starts to allow you to think of how you'd build those systems without knowing a single thing about the disease target that has appeared, because you can define a model for the instrumental parameters for that PCR device to record the new virus that you've just brought back, sequenced and analysed. So some couple of nice tools here that talk about automatic ontology generation and use. This is something called Terminizer, terminizer.org, if you're interested in it. And what it does is it takes a sample of text that you've entered into it, and it runs it against the Obo Foundry, and it annotates and asks you whether these terms are the ones that you mean. And you can go down and you can say, yes, I did mean that particular term, no, I meant that one, can I search for another? And then effectively annotate your chunk of text against the ontologies, and then save that as XML or as RDF to reuse later on. In a similar way to the previous talk and some other things that have been talked about, there's a lot of work going on at the moment about text mining to generate at least fractions of ontologies. So this is a great paper by Chris Brewster, et al., Robert Stevens, and Simon Jupp, where what they did is they mined a whole text corpus for animal behaviour and gave David Shotton, who works at the University of Oxford, fragments of an animal behaviour ontology, which he did all of the arrangement for and created in record time quite a sophisticated, quite a detailed animal behaviour ontology with a great deal of coverage. They haven't got to the point where they could generate the whole ontology from the text. I think that probably is something that will be difficult, if not impossible, with just plain text. But the point where you've got a whole bunch of information, you can gather fragments of ontology and then arrange them into something that's very useful very quickly, I think that's a really interesting development. So ultimately, in conclusion, we and various people are working on a range of tools that you can imagine providing this semantic framework that allows scientists users to manage their metadata and to communicate it to other people, and then to standardize on those things that are necessary to obtain data sharing and interoperability in their data community. And they provide this framework for the persistence and characterization of meaning within the desktop applications they're working on, so that it may be used with all of these great W3C tools that we've heard people talk about and that we use quite regularly at Oxford. But I contest that these tools work best when they're embedded in people's real working environments. It is essential that it's as easy as possible to use these annotation tools, because if they're not that easy, then people will just not do the annotation. Finally, just a few acknowledgements of all the people who've been working on and providing valuable advice for our group in Oxford on this. Thank you very much.
Hi. You have a specific experience using SNOMED ontology?
Yes, it works. We've played around with SNOMED and we've hooked it up briefly just to see how the thing looked. And yes, it works quite happily. SNOMED you can get as an OWL ontology. You can downplay the OWL ontology into a SCOS representation, and then it just loads into the metadata registry directly. We've done that with Mesh. We're currently working on the NCI thesaurus, because one of the use cases that we want is somebody modelling on an airplane where they haven't got any internet connection, or where they're behind a firewall, perhaps in a pharmaceutical company, who don't want to expose what kind of work they're doing, but want to ensure that they're interoperable with the standards that are out there. So they need to be able to bring their own copies of whatever resources they're using in-house into their own tools and then reuse it. So yes, it will work quite happily with SNOMED.
And one more question over here.
Hi.
Hi, Andrew.
How quickly are the standards changing, and how hard is it to keep the data that's been encoded in some sort of standard up to date with the current standards?
Well, that question kind of comes in two parts. The first part is the metadata registry allows you to describe what is there, how it was at the point of data capture, and that's an important part of the function. The second part is it provides quite flexible ways of taking that definition at the time and relating it to the current context, to our current understanding of things. So the way it's linked into the ontologies, for instance, talks about how we see that in our model of the world today. So yes, it allows for that. I won't pretend that some of the issues that surround that moving forward over decades and the repurposing and reuse of data outside the original context are problems that are solved. But at least you have the start and you have the ability to do these things and the placeholders where you put these pieces of information. And once you've got data like this, then you can just load the whole stuff, spill it out into RDF and start playing around with it to your heart's content, and query the metadata and data simultaneously and see what transformations that you can produce.
So thank you very much, and thank you to all our speakers, and we appreciate it. Thank you.